Hello and welcome to Close Reading Classic Literature with me, Dr. Octavia Cox. A while ago I made a video about the worst marriages in Jane Austen's novels, and there's one marriage that I didn't go into a lot of detail about there because I think it deserves greater expansion, and that's what I'm going to talk about today. So today I'm going to talk about Sense and Sensibility, and I'm going to talk about the off-stage marriage between Mrs. Eliza Brandon and Colonel Brandon's elder brother. And there are two questions particularly that I want to ask. The first is, why is the story of Mrs. Eliza Brandon in the novel Sense and Sensibility at all? This is a character who we never meet and who doesn't really have any direct effect on the plot of Sense and Sensibility at all. So Mrs. Eliza Brandon is a character that doesn't serve a direct function in the plot. Other than that, Marianne reminds Colonel Brandon of her. So why is she presented to us? Secondly, and furthermore, why does Jane Austen present the story, the background, the narrative of Mrs. Eliza Brandon in the way that she does? What are we as readers supposed to take from the way in which Austen presents Mrs. Eliza Brandon's story to us through Colonel Brandon, who's telling the story to Eleanor? So today I'm going to analyse a seemingly irrelevant, or at least not particularly important, part of the narrative, the downfall of Mrs. Eliza Brandon. And I want to show that actually Mrs. Eliza Brandon's story is fundamental to understanding Austen's purpose as a novelist. And to do this, I'm going to look at the Gothic or melodramatic elements in Sense and Sensibility in this story about Mrs. Eliza Brandon, and I'm going to compare it to the way that Austen treats the Gothic in Northanger Abbey in order to show what Austen is trying to do in her novels and how she's trying to set them apart from the novels that have gone before. Remember, if you like what I do here on my channel where I analyse classic literature, then do please subscribe, and if you like the video then do give it a big thumbs up. It does help me out in YouTube's algorithm. In Jane Austen's Sense and Sensibility, we are told of a marriage between Eliza and the elder Brandon brother. Now, it's important that this is an off-stage marriage, so we never see either of those characters. We never see Mrs. Eliza Brandon or Colonel Brandon's older brother, or indeed his father, who will be important in the story also. We don't see them in the flesh as readers. We are only told about them through narrative, told about them through a story. And what are novels other than narratives and stories, which is just worth bearing in mind as we move through the analysis. So we hear about it from Colonel Brandon in a first person monologue. He tells this story, tells this narrative to Eleanor, who's listening to him. And it is melodrama of the highest kind. Absolutely, you could say, bog standard Gothic storytelling. As I'm reading through it, we should bear in mind that both Sense and Sensibility and Northanger Abbey had their genesis in the 1790s, which means that they were both originally composed in the 1790s, even though they weren't published until the 19th century. Sense and Sensibility in 1811, and then Northanger Abbey after Jane Austen had died. It was published in December 1817, although it's dated 1818. They had their genesis, they had their start, they had their origin much earlier, as I've said, in the 1790s, when the Gothic genre was really at its height. In Northanger Abbey, Jane Austen parodies and mocks the Gothic, which was the fashionable novel of choice in the 1790s, as I've said. And Jane Austen mocks it and parodies it in Northanger Abbey. And I'm going to suggest that in Sense and Sensibility, she's also positioning herself against the fashionable novels of the 1790s, the Gothic, by suggesting that she's going to write different novels from what have gone before. So in both Northanger Abbey and Sense and Sensibility, I would suggest Jane Austen uses the Gothic in order to position herself and the kind of novelist that she wants to be, the kind of novels that she wants to write. So this is Brandon's narrative. This lady, Mrs. Eliza Brandon, was one of my nearest relations, an orphan from her infancy and under the guardianship of my father. So right from the beginning of his narrative, we have absolutely bog standard Gothic tropes here. She's an orphan. And at the beginning of Northanger Abbey, Austen makes a similar kind of joke. So in the opening of Northanger Abbey, where Austen sets up and says Catherine Morland is nothing like a heroine that you would expect to find in a novel. And one of the reasons why she's not like the expected heroine in a novel is because her mother is still alive. She's not an orphan. So the text reads that Mrs. Morland, instead of dying in bringing Catherine into the world as anybody might expect, she still lived on. And of course, as anybody might expect, that anybody is those people who read Gothic novels. It's what you would expect when you read a Gothic novel. And Eliza was under the guardianship of my father. And here, again, we might think of the comparison between General Tilney in Northanger Abbey, who is arguably a Gothic villain made into everyday, ordinary English society, and Mr. Brandon and his Gothic villainy as it's presented here in Sense and Sensibility. Our ages were nearly the same, and from our earliest years we were playfellows and friends. I cannot remember the time when I did not love Eliza. And I think it's worth pointing out that, yes, this narrative does reveal to us a lot about why Colonel Brandon is gloomy in his own terms, and the similarities that he sees between Marianne and Mrs. Eliza Brandon, and that fleshes out some of his character for us. But at the same time, Austen could have done that in other ways. She could have made it clear that he has loved and lost and has been heartbroken before without having such a Gothic presentation presented to us. She could have done it in a different way to make it clear that Brandon had been heartbroken before. She doesn't need to do it in the way that she does. I cannot remember the time when I did not love Eliza, and my affection for her as we grew up was such as, perhaps judging from my present forlorn and cheerless gravity, you might think me incapable of having ever felt. Hers for me was, I believe, fervent as the attachment of your sister to Mr. Willoughby, and it was, though from a different cause, no less unfortunate. At 17, she was lost to me forever. And this is really the language of Gothic excess. Forever is the kind of full OTT language that you might expect in a Gothic novel. And Colonel Brandon's narrative is absolutely full of these kind of Gothic excesses in terms of the language. So here, she was lost to me forever. And later, the misery of her situation overcame all her resolution. Eliza sinks into a life of sin and was so altered, so faded, worn down by acute suffering of every kind. These don't need to be presented as strongly as they are for the meaning to be made clear. She was lost to me, Brandon could have said, but he doesn't. He uses the Gothic excess. She was lost to me forever. And equally, the misery of her situation overcame her resolution, he could have said, but he doesn't. He adds the Gothic all. And so altered, so faded, worn down by acute suffering, he could have said. But no, acute suffering of every kind. And this is the kind of language that Austen mocks and parodies in Northanger Abbey. This kind of Gothic excess. All, every, forever. So in Northanger Abbey, the exact same phrase is used by the narrative voice, but is used to mock and undermine Catherine, the heroine. In Northanger Abbey, we have a description of Henry Tilney quite early in the novel and Catherine's thinking about him. He looked as handsome and as lively as ever, and was talking with interest to a fashionable and pleasing-looking young woman who leant on his arm, and whom Catherine immediately guessed to be his sister, thus unthinkingly throwing away a fair opportunity of considering him lost to her forever by being married already. So you can see that the narrative voice in Northanger Abbey uses this language explicitly to mock the idea of the Gothic excess of imagining someone as being lost to you forever. And yet, at the same time, that's exactly the language that Colonel Brandon uses in Sense and Sensibility to describe his relationship with Mrs. Eliza Brandon. She was married against her inclination to my brother. Married against her inclination, again, a very Gothic trope, having the heroine married to somebody against her will. Her fortune was large and our family estate much encumbered. And this again is a standard Gothic trope, that you have a orphan heroine who is abused and misused by her relatives for their own financial gain. And this, I fear, is all that can be said for the conduct of one who was at once her uncle and guardian. So they're related, they're family, they're related by blood. And again, being misused by a close family member is very Gothic. My brother did not deserve her. He did not even love her. I had hoped that her regard for me would support her under any difficulty. And for some time it did. But at last, the misery of her situation, for she experienced great unkindness, overcame all her resolution. I've already dealt with that kind of Gothic excess language there. Though she had promised me that nothing, but how blindly I relate, I have never told you how this was brought on. We were within a few hours of eloping together for Scotland. So Scotland, that's to Gretna Green, where the laws about marriage were more relaxed than they were in England at that time. You can see another Gothic trope. We've got a couple who want to elope, who are thwarted in their attempts to marry each other. The treachery, very Gothic word, or the folly of my cousin's maid betrayed us. I was banished to the house of a relation far distant, and she was allowed no liberty, no society, no amusement till my father's point was gained. Brandon is banished and Eliza is imprisoned, allowed no liberty. Again, this is very, very Gothic in terms of its language and the story. Austen had laughed at a similar idea in Northanger Abbey in the opening again, when she's describing her heroine, Catherine, and how she's different from your standard expected Gothic heroine because she's not locked up by her rogue father. So the text reads that Mr. Morland was not in the least addicted to locking up his daughters. And in the final chapters of Northanger Abbey, Jane Austen makes a joke about having a cruel father thwart the marriage of the young hero and heroine. General Tilney expressly forbade the connection, that is, the marriage between Henry and Catherine. As a result of General Tilney's anger, Henry returned to what was now his only home, that is, his comfortable parsonage house at Woodston, to watch over his young plantations and extend his improvements for her sake, to whose share in them he looked anxiously forward. In other words, he lives in his own home and takes up gardening. And this is mockingly described by the narrative voice as Henry's banishment. Brandon's narrative continues. I had depended on her fortitude too far, and the blow was a severe one. But had her marriage been happy, so young as I then was, a few months must have reconciled me to it, or at least I should not have now to lament it. This, however, was not the case. My brother had no regard for her. His pleasures were not what they ought to have been, and from the first he treated her unkindly. Eliza being entreated unkindly by her husband, who doesn't appreciate her, doesn't value her. Standard Gothic trope. He should have protected her, he should have looked after her, and what does he do? He exploits her. The consequence of this, upon a mind so young, so lively, so inexperienced as Mrs. Brandon's, was but too natural. She resigned herself at first to all the misery of her situation, and happy had it been if she had not lived to overcome those regrets which the remembrance of me occasioned. But can we wonder that with such a husband to provoke inconstancy, and without a friend to advise or restrain her, so again she's really all alone, she's got absolutely no one, her husband is mistreating her, she's friendless, she has nobody in the world at all to turn to. For my father lived only a few months after their marriage, and I was with my regiment in the East Indies. She should fall. And here, in She Should Fall, explicitly we have Eliza as fallen woman. And post-Eve, what happens to women who fall? What happens to women who have bitten the fruit of knowledge? Of course, they must be punished. And that is really the moral lesson in many traditional conservative Gothic novels at the time, that moral lesson that if woman falls, if woman bites from the tree of knowledge, if she does what she's told she shouldn't do, then she must be punished, in narrative terms. Had I remained in England, perhaps, but I meant to promote the happiness of both by removing from her for years, and for that purpose had procured my exchange. So he's taken a different job, which means that he'll be away longer. The shock which her marriage had given me, he continued with a voice of great agitation, was of trifling weight, was nothing to what I felt when I heard about 2 years afterwards of her divorce. It was that which threw this gloom. Even now the recollection of what I suffered. He could say no more. And then I'll skip over a bit, back to his narrative. It was nearly 3 years after this unhappy period before I returned to England. My first care when I did arrive was of course to seek for her, but the search was as fruitless as it was melancholy. I could not trace her beyond her first seducer, and there was every reason to fear that she had removed with him only to sink deeper in a life of sin. Her legal allowance was not adequate to her fortune, nor sufficient for her comfortable maintenance, and I learnt from my brother that the power of receiving it had been made over to some months before to another person. He imagined, and calmly could he imagine it, that her extravagance and consequent distress had obliged her to dispose of it for some immediate relief. Brandon's brother callously blames Eliza for her pecuniary difficulties, for her money troubles. This is, of course, despite depriving her of the money himself. And this is the kind of callous cruelty that we see again and again in Gothic novels of husbands to their wives. And we can think again of General Tilney and Mrs. Tilney in Northanger Abbey and what Catherine suspects about the marriage, the relationship between General Tilney and Mrs. Tilney, in which she suspects that he has murdered his wife. And here in Sense and Sensibility, what do we have essentially but Mr. Brandon, the brother Brandon's cruelty, his callous cruelty, effectively murdering his wife, even if he doesn't actively actually hit her over the head and murder her, but morally murdering her through mistreatment, through cruelty. At last, however, and after I'd been 6 months in England, I did find her. Regard for a former servant of my own who had since fallen into misfortune carried me to visit him in a sponging house, that's a debtor's prison, where he was confined for debt, and there in the same house under a similar confinement was my unfortunate sister, so altered, so faded, worn down by acute suffering of every kind. Hardly could I believe the melancholy and sickly figure before me to be the remains of the lovely, blooming, healthful girl on whom I had once doted. Again, this is another kind of standard trope of the Gothic novel and the figure of the poor heroine, which is that Eliza's physical decline is a sort of manifestation or physical evidence of her sensibility and of her moral goodness. It's the body's way of showing that she can't tolerate this life of sin, that her body can't remain healthy, has been sort of corrupted, has been degraded by the immoral life that she has been leading. In that sense, her sort of physical suffering, her physical decline, represents her inner turmoil and moral goodness. The body can't remain lovely and blooming and healthful, because if she did remain in that way, then it would seem that she hadn't really sort of suffered because of her emotional distress. So, for example, we might compare a character like Lydia Bennet, who, after she has sunk into a life of sin with Wickham and comes back married, is she physically depleted in any way? No, she's still as robust, still as healthy, still as rambunctious, etc. in her animal spirits, in terms of the language of the novel. She comes back and she isn't physically any different, and that suggests that she hasn't been emotionally affected by what has happened in any way. She hasn't had this sort of moral reckoning in a way that a character like Mrs. Eliza Brandon has, or heroines in Gothic novels where their emotional distress is kind of manifested in physical decline. What I endured in so beholding her, but I have no right to wound your feelings by attempting to describe it. I have pained you too much already, that she was to all appearance in the last stage of a consumption. Yes, in such a situation it was my greatest comfort. Life could do nothing for her beyond giving time for a better preparation for death, and that was given. I saw her placed in comfortable lodgings, and under proper attendance I visited her every day during the rest of her short life, and was with her in her last moments. So the spiritual preparation for death means that she has repented, and that she's ready to die, she's ready to meet God, and she's repented fully and properly, etc., for her sins. And in novelistic terms, in Gothic novels, often dying was a heroine's proper repentance for a life of sin, for having been morally corrupted or morally degraded in some way. And there are parallels here between, for example, Mrs. Eliza Brandon and Samuel Richardson's heroine, Clarissa Harlowe. In standard conventionally moralistic novels of the time, really, for a female character, if she has descended into a life of sin or if she's broken moral codes, then really death is the only way that she can atone for them, that she's essentially washed clear of her sins if she has this narrative punishment happen to her in the novel. And in Sense and Sensibility, this is explicitly setting us up for Marianne's illness. When she becomes ill later in the novel, there's a comparison to be drawn between the fate, the illness of Mrs. Eliza Brandon and the novelistic conventions that her fate sort of encapsulates, and what happens to Marianne, which is essentially that she's ill for a few days, but we're told she gets over it really quite quickly. In 4 days, in less than a week, she's already over it. And the text tells us, Marianne's illness, though weakening in its kind, had not been long enough to make her recovery slow, and with youth, natural strength, and her mother's presence in aid, it proceeded so smoothly as to enable her to remove, within 4 days after the arrival of the latter, into Mrs. Palmer's dressing room. Marianne is absolutely not punished in novelistic terms, and Marianne kind of comes to recognise for herself that she almost thought she had to become ill, because then that would show that she was properly affected by what had happened to her with Willoughby, if that makes sense. So she had almost willed herself into illness, like a Mrs. Eliza Brandon kind of character, in order to show how much she suffered, as if there had to be a physical decline in order to prove moral repentance. So the question I ask again then is, why is this long narrative in the novel of Sense and Sensibility at all? And why is it in the novel in the way that it is? Why does Jane Austen formulate it in this way? Which, by the way, is always the question to ask yourself when you're doing literary analysis. Why has the author done it in this way when they could have chosen to do it in another way? Brandon, after his speech, says to Eleanor, "But to what does all this lead?" This is also a rhetorical question to the reader. Essentially, Austen is asking readers to think, what was the point of that? Why were we told all of that? To what does this lead? She's poking readers to reflect on what Brandon has just told us and asks us to think, why is this relevant? Earlier I used the term melodrama, and I used it advisedly. So melodrama is defined in the Oxford English Dictionary as a genre that especially excites by exaggeration and sensationalism. And the term was just coming into English language usage when Austen was in her mid-teens. So the first use that the Oxford English Dictionary quotes is from 1789, and it's from Charles Burney, who was the brother of Fanny Burney, the famous novelist who Jane Austen really, really admired. But it's relevant, I think, that the first usage is from 1789. It was coming in the 1780s and into the 1790s, exactly at the time that Sense and Sensibility and Northanger Abbey were being composed and being thought about, and also that in these formative years when Austen was really thinking through what she wanted to what kind of writer she wanted to be, that melodrama was just coming into vogue, was just coming into fashion. And remember, that's texts which excite by exaggeration and sensationalism. And really, that's the opposite of what Jane Austen wants to do in her own novels. She almost has a kind of horror of exciting by excess and sensationalism. That quality is mocked and kind of parodied in Northanger Abbey, but I would suggest that it's punctured in perhaps more serious ways, or at least less obviously comic, mocking ways in Sense and Sensibility, but that puncturing of excess and sensationalism is very much integral to understanding what Sense and Sensibility is trying to tell us as a novel. I mentioned earlier that the melodrama or the Gothic excess of Mrs. Eliza Brandon and the Brandon brothers' marriage happens off stage. And it's absolutely crucial, I think, that it happens off stage. It happens off stage, it seems to me, because Austen is saying explicitly, I don't want to write that kind of novel. It's off stage because she's saying, I could have written that. I know all about the Gothic tropes and the usual standard stories, but I'm not going to tell you that story. I'm going to tell you this different story. Austen doesn't want to write conventional novels with conventional plots and conventional language, conventional moralizing and conventional outcomes. She wants to write something more interesting, more nuanced and more complex. Thank you very much indeed for listening. I do hope you've enjoyed thinking about this Gothic excess and why it's in Sense and Sensibility, why the figure of Mrs. Eliza Brandon is in Sense and Sensibility. Although the term wasn't invented yet, but the realism that Austen is trying to articulate in Sense and Sensibility, as opposed to the kind of Gothic moralising of novels that are gone before, of conventional novels that had gone before. Remember, if you like what I do here on my channel where I analyse Gothic texts, then where I analyse classic literature, sometimes Gothic texts, then do please subscribe. And if you've liked the video, then do give it a big thumbs up. It really does help me out in YouTube's algorithm. And I'd love to know your thoughts on Sense and Sensibility and its Gothic elements. And if there are any other parts of any other Austen novels where you think an apparently irrelevant detail or an irrelevant section or a character who doesn't seem to be that important, suddenly you realise has come to be absolutely integral to understanding Jane Austen. Do leave any comments that you have below. I really do love hearing from you. And very appropriately for talking about Gothic literature, it is actually really, really snowing quite hard outside.